Pinnachia, a steampunk fairy tale by Joy Findlay. Once, there was a time called the Great Separation, an era where the extremely rich ruled the world from large, mechanical floating cities scattered across the sky, and those who were poor lived grounded on Earth. The grounded worked and strived for recognition through steam engineering, electrical invention, and the making of fantastical gadgets, so they could be invited into Cloud City societies and join those who lived cloudside. It was during this era that the Earth's most famous mechanical engineer and inventor designed and built the world's first Cloud City, Skylands. Once it was built, Lord Petto, through tragic loss, decided to live grounded in a small rustic community below this great city. His was a story of lost love and found faith, and a vow to stay grounded for as long as he lived. But this is not his story. This story is of a young mechanical boy Lord Petto created, lost, then found again. This is the story of Pinnachia. In a castle that sat on top of the bluffs of white sands, there was a lab. This white stone-walled lab was situated in the basement of the grand castle, and was where Lord Petto spent many a year living and working. It was on a long stainless steel table that sat his latest and greatest invention, his pride and joy. The machine looked almost like any other 12-year-old boy of that era, except for the fact he was made entirely of mechanical parts. Clothed in breeches and a long-sleeved shirt, he had a backpack strapped to his back and around his middle, and appeared as any other young schoolboy, actually, with sticky-up black hair and striking pale blue eyes. It was that mechanical boy who was about to be woken up for the very first time. Pinnachia's first impression of life was statistically charged as his lenses focused on the kind and worn face of his maker. Smiling back at the engineer's welcome, Pinnachia giggled at a tickling sensation running down his arm. It was another of the engineer's inventions, a mechanical spider called Spidey. "Welcome, my boy, welcome. I am Lord Petto, but you may call me Pepe." The aging inventor patted the mechanical boy on his back, although the older gentleman's black hair was showing a lot more salt than pepper these days. He still held himself with the dignity of a king, even when dressed in a work jacket covered in grease. Lord Petto made a few more adjustments to Pinnachia's leg and feet joints, then removed a small pair of boots from an older, faulty model on the back bench and placed them on the boy's feet. "Now try out your voice box for me, so we can see that all your systems work," Lord Petto asked. "Pepe, it is very nice to meet you," the boy said. "I am Pin. His hand went to his small mouth as he hiccuped his own name. With a hoot and a laugh, Lord Petto thumped his hand on his thigh. Smiling wide, he tightened a screw on Pinnachia's jaw, tinkered with the matrix of wires in his open chest, and adjusted the pack on his back before closing everything up. "Well, Pin, that should do it. How does that feel?" he asked the boy. "Feel?" Pin shook his head, not sure what the word meant. Does everything appear to be in working order?" Pepe helped Pin off the stainless steel bench and encouraged him with a nod to take his first few steps, causing the older gentleman's grin to widen further. "Why, yes, sir. Everything does indeed appear to be working." Pin tripped over a boot, grabbed the bench top, lost his balance, and landed on his bottom. The Lord hooted again, excitement brewing in his chest as he picked the small boy off the workshop floor. "Okay, take it easy, my boy. One thing at a time," he chuckled. And, well, that was that. Pin's first day alive on soil. It was said that as the sun set behind the steam clouds of the floating city that day, Lord Peto continued to teach Pin everything he knew about the world and what it meant to be alive. Chapter 2. Many months and a few mishaps later, Pin had absorbed all that he had to learn from his maker. He curiously watched the elder gentleman express his joy over his amazing engineering projects. The boy asked all the right questions and smiled at all the right places in the conversation. He learned that Pepe's particularly enjoyed describing his giant hot air balloon invention that he never quite got off the ground. Halfway through discussing design issues and malfunctions of the giant balloon, Lord Peto paused, rolled up old blueprints, and filed them away. Pin waited as Peto rummaged through a few boxes and came back with something hidden in his hands. He smiled at Pin then, handed him a small pouch. "This is for you, my boy," he proclaimed, dropping the object into Pin's waiting palms. "For me? Is it a gift?" His eyes widened. "Yes, Pin, your first gift, if you don't count the new shoes we fitted you last week." Pin looked up at his maker, remembering to smile in gratitude as he was taught. "Well done, Pin. Gratitude and a smile will take you far in this world. Now I think you are all set." It was all he could do not to go with Pin, but Lord Peto knew he needed to test Pin out in the world. "Sir," asked Pin, "I am all set?" "Why, yes, my boy." Peto picked up a cold cup of tea. He took a sip, regretfully swallowing it down, and put the teacup back on the tea tray. "Yes, my boy, it's time you discovered the world for yourself." Lord Peto believed it to be a good plan. Lord Peto took Pin under his arm and led him upstairs to the large lounge windows, paused for a moment, then stretched his arm over the view of the majestic White Sands Bay. "Pin, look before you. There's a world out there waiting for you, and a world out there that you need to learn from. There are many villages in this land, many Cloud City ports that hold incredible adventures and wonderful gadgetry treasures. I am only one lonely old man, a brilliant genius, I might add, but I have taught you everything I know, bar subatomic engineering and steam-powered explosives. Today you go into the world to learn from others, and to help others learn about you. Today the world will finally know you, my greatest engineering achievement, my most fantastical gadgetry creation lives." It was the finest speech Lord Peto had ever given, if you don't count Skyland's inaugural speech, or his proposal to the love of his life, or his valedictorian speech. The point is that since he became a lonesome recluse, this was Lord Peto's finest speech. He placed 4 coins in Pin's gloved hand, closed his little fingers around them, and looked into his smiling eyes. "Pin, my son, I need you to be brave and go alone to the markets. 2 Tesla coils have blown in the foyer, and we need replacements months ago." He placed his old and worn top hat on the mechanical boy's head, repositioned the goggles, and patted his upper arm in support. "Don't give the coins to anyone but a merchant, and be sure to use your manners. Don't talk with strangers, and be careful to lift your new shoes like I told you." Lord Peto wrung his hands. "Take Spidey with you. Use the bottom exit and close the door on the way out. We don't need it flooding again when the tide comes in." Yes, sir," stuttered Pin. He took the coins, placed them in his new pouch on his belt, and headed down all 604 steps to the castle's back entrance. He had walked some distance along the beach before Spidey tapped him on his neck and pointed back to the house. "Ah, yes, the door. Spidey, thank you," he said, returning to close it. "We don't need it flooding again when the tide comes in." He mimicked his maker perfectly. Chapter 3. The town was a small village bustling with the life of engineers, tinkers, merchants, and the like. As a Skylands port, it held not only a harbor for seafaring ships, but a sky dock stood alongside for the 6 zeppelins that ferried goods, tourists, and trade to Skylands. It was towards this zeppelin dock that Pinnachia was walking, looking down at his shoes to make sure he lifted his feet correctly, as Lord Peto had directed him. And he wasn't exactly watching where he was going. He bumped straight into someone, lost his balance, and fell flat on his back. "Oh," said a delicate voice. "Are you okay? Goodness, you should watch where you're going." Pinnachia looked up to find a pretty girl his own size looking down at him with her hands on her hips. She wore a dark blue bodice over a white high-collared blouse with matching skirts. Pin hadn't seen a girl before and was amazed how one could walk around wearing so much material. He looked her up and down, from the bonnet covering her golden curly locks to the black boots that modestly covered her ankles. He'd never met anyone outside the workshop before, and since only Lord Peto lived in the castle, well, he'd never met anyone else before. He stared at her with his mouth open. "Are you all right?" she repeated herself. "Well, stop staring and say something, silly," she said. "I'm not allowed to talk to strangers," Pin blurted out, and smacked his hand over his mouth with a clang. Her giggle made him smile, even though he didn't know what she was giggling at. He took her outstretched hand and shook it, all the while sitting on his bottom. "No, silly. Let me help you up," she giggled again. He took her offer to help him off the ground and nearly pulled her on top of him. "Oof!" she exclaimed. "Goodness, you're heavier than you look." Pinnachia stood, helping her with her balance, and returned the welcoming smile. "I've never seen you here before. Are you from Cloudside?" She tipped her bonnet up to see him better. Pin stood in front of her, staring with his pale blue eyes. "What is it like to live up there in that steam-powered wonderland?" Still staring, he rocked a little in his new shoes. Frowning, she took a step back, perplexed by his silence. "Well, are you going to say something, silly?" "I'm not allowed to talk to strangers." "Oh, well, goodness, where are my manners?" "I'm Honesty, Honesty goodness. And I live with my father on Copper Lane. Well, now that you know me, you can talk to me, yes? She held out her small gloved hand. He took her hand to shake and paused a moment, tilting his head to one side, like he'd seen his Peppy do when thinking. I guess you are correct, Honesty. Honesty goodness. No, just honesty, she giggled again. Honesty. It is very nice to meet you. My name is Pinnachia, he said with a smile and a nod. But you can call me Pin. That's what Lord Pethoke calls me. With a gasp, Honesty pulled her hand away to cover her mouth. Lord Pethoke? You know Lord Pethoke? Yes, Honesty. Lord Pethoke is my Pepe. He made me. Oh, goodness, Pin. You were made by Lord Pethoke? She began to slowly walk around him, inspecting every rivet, every seam, his hat, goggles, boots, and all. Yes, he nodded with a smile. Well, stop staring and say something, silly, he said, using the very words she used on him. She gave a giggle and smacked his arm. Goodness gracious me! I can't believe you live with Lord Pethoke. I've never ever met him before, but he is by far the most amazing engineer in all the world. He invented the slap horn, the walking dog, the boulders of man, and designed and built Skylands, the grandest and most magnificent place in the world. She swept a hand towards a city in the sky that floated above the bay. Pin turned his face up towards the city, but he did not know why she was so excited about it. He turned back to watch her, enthralled at the sight. Have you ever been to Skylands, Pin? She was still staring skyward, her hands clasped together under her chin. I've never been outside Pepe's castle until today, he informed her. Gracious me, she muttered, staring back at him. Then with a jump and a great squeal, she startled Pin, who once again landed back on his bottom. Pin, oh, Pin, you must, oh, you must, she declared, jumping up and down like one of Lord Pethoke's self-agitating pogo sticks. As he picked himself off the ground again, Honesty grabbed his arm and pulled him quickly along the road. Chapter 4. Oh, Pin, this is perfect. I can't go without an escort. It would be amazing for Lord Pethoke's latest invention to meet his first invention. Oh, Pin, you must come with me. She prattled on in excitement. Pin was a little perplexed by this stage and had to maintain his balance while she pulled on his arm. She stopped skipping and took his hand, whipping him around a corner so fast his goggles nearly fell off his head. She held on tight and marched him towards the sky dock. What a perfect way to start the day, she declared, and continued on about being her third time skyside. But since her father was a fisherman, they couldn't migrate there. Blah, blah, blah. No, truly, she told him, blah, blah, blah. It was enough to add to his confusion. But he stopped before they reached the dock office, nearly knocking her off balance again. With quick, smart reflexes, he held her upright before she landed on her bustle in a puddle of greasy water. Honesty, what is this blah, blah, blah you speak of? He asked. Oh, you silly, she giggled. Then she realized he was serious. She explained, my father, he won't take me cloudside. He says it's not a place for a merchant's daughter, let alone one wealthy as I. It's like he hates me and won't let me have any fun at all. She folded her arms in front of her and huffed her hair out of her eyes. Pin didn't know what to make of her actions. He'd never seen a person pout before. Spidey tapped his neck again and pointed towards the markets, reminding Pin of his task at hand. But Pin was too distracted. After all of Honesty's blah-blah-blahing on about it, he really wanted to see Skylands. He pulled out the 4 gold coins and held them in his open palm. When Honesty saw the coins, her eyes went wide with excitement. "Honesty, I am to go to the markets to bring back coils for Pepe. He needs them for his foyer," he tells her. She tries to touch the coins, but Pin closed his hand before she could. "These are not for you, Honesty. They are for a merchant," he declared. "But Pin, we can buy everything we need Cloudside. Don't you know that, silly?" "Skyland has merchants, Honesty?" he asked, as Spidey tapped his neck again. Pin took one look at Honesty and her excitement and flicked Spidey to the cobble street road. "They have merchants, pensions, coppers, tinkers, grocers, and more, Pin. It's the most amazing place in the world." She took his hand and again towed him towards the docks. Standing at the Skydock office booth, she paid 1 coin for herself and another for Pin. When the ticket agent eyed them both, Pin remembered to smile his gratitude as Pepe taught. With their tickets in hand, they both boarded the small silver and orange Zeppelin and found a seat near the starboard side. Chapter 5. The trip felt awkward to Pin, with his internal gyro-who's-he-what's-it resetting his balance more than once, leaving him a little dizzy. Flying in a Zeppelin felt worse than walking on sand, and if he could have eaten, well, he might have lost his breakfast quite soon into the trip. They flew slowly towards Skyland, overlooking seafaring vessels traversing the ocean below. Birds dipped and soared, avoiding getting too close as the noisy Zeppelin hovered past. Seagulls could have been seen closer to the shore, and sea eagles could be seen riding the air currents higher up. They drifted past clouds, which excited Honesty all over again. She voiced her need to touch them to see how cold they were, totally forgetting they would soon be walking on a floating platform that hovered in the clouds. Honesty didn't stop talking. She prattled on and on about the fair, the markets, the children's only playland, and how she was now tall enough to enter. She talked about dresses and shoes and rumors of all-you-could-eat children's buffet. But at the mention of food, while 600 meters above soil, it was enough for Pin to turn his ears off and close his eyes until they docked on Skylands. He noticed the vibration of the Zeppelin's motor had changed frequency, and that Honesty was no longer tapping his arm every few minutes with her nonstop jabbering. Yes, jabbering. He knew what the word meant, especially since his Pepe kept telling him to stop it frequently in his early days. So without the jabbering and movement changes, Pin set his sensors going again to find Honesty had indeed stopped talking and was pressing up against the window, staring up into the city that surrounded them. At first glance, Skyland looked like a metal metropolis, devoid of order. Buildings placed at awkward angles, steam train tracks scattered about, dark towers and many smokestacks. There was a towering crystal glass atrium right in the middle, front and center. Everything was buffed to shine, giving it a look that it constantly glowed. He followed the squealing Honesty across the gangplank onto the skydock and watched as the Zeppelin crew worked their jobs with seasoned efficiency. He turned to watch families entering the train station, the children bubbling with joy. He watched ladies standing on the side of the narrow streets, selling metal red roses from their cane baskets, and newsboys waving their papers in the air. A gentleman at the end of the gangplank handed Honesty 2 free tickets to the children's buffet, compliments of Skyland. Honesty turned to Pin, waving her ticket high with a smile on her face. Pin wondered why the gentleman hadn't given the children with their families the same courtesy. But before he could ask, Honesty took his hand again and pulled him onto the steam locomotive's platform. They stepped onto one of the 5 miniature open carriages and rode the black and silver train to the fair, a must-see for all tourists, as Honesty put it. He'd heard that fairs were scary places, where they would throw you up and down and all around. He wasn't sure if he wanted to experience the fair. As they entered through the tall wrought iron gates, straightway they were immediately enthralled by the delicate spun metal cages that harbored some of the most dangerous animals in the world. On a dozen perches nearby sat lifelike metal birds with tail feathers of quilled brass and copper. They found a cycle hire stall and paid for a penny farthing rental each. With candy floss in hand, Honesty insisted they both have some, even though he didn't eat at all. They raced around the fair, cycling in and out of the exhibits, past the mechanical jugglers and stilted acrobats, through the Hall of Mirrors, and came to a stop at the Ferris wheel. "Oh, please, Honesty squealed. This had preceded every request the girl begged of him, so Pin knew he needed only wait till she had finished jumping and make her request. "Oh, you must! She danced again, her excitement showing. "Come for a ride. It's the largest Ferris wheel in the whole world." He wasn't so sure about that fact, as he'd just heard the week prior that Mabelland had a large wheel boasting even bigger than Skyland's wheel. But as he had had enough trouble with his internal gyro who's-it-what's-it, constantly resetting on the Zeppelin, he politely told Honesty that he'd wait for her. "You enjoy your ride, and I shall hold your sugar floss and wait for your return." Her face fell a little, but she handed him the last of the candy floss and joined the queue with the other children her size. Pin watched her with the other children in the Ferris wheel seat as it swung slowly around. He lost sight of her and used the opportunity to look around him at the fair, the city, and the world around him. It was different to what he expected, from what Lord Peto had said about the ways of the world and its people. He expected a far more dangerous adventure. Upon returning the cycles to the vendor, Honesty declared that she was indeed famished. Pin pointed to the all-you-can-eat children's buffet sign and wondered out loud why they were eating children. "Oh, Pin, you are so funny," said Honesty, giggling again. She took his arm and they followed a group of other young children from the fair towards the children's buffet house, pink candy floss fluttering away on the wind in their wake. Chapter 6. Having shown the butler at the door their free buffet tickets, Honesty and Pin seated themselves at a metal table in a large dining hall with about 12 other children. Pin watched as the children waited for someone else to start before they all began, helping themselves to platefuls of food. White and silver platters with navy peach trimming lay on each table, overflowing with many different types of meats, cheeses, dried foodstuff, and pastries. Pitcher of cherry-flavored cordial stood next to silver and peach goblets. Honesty had never seen so much food in all her life, and made sure to tell Pin this fact more than once. The hungry children ate and drank at first with great fervor, but once they were almost full and saw there was still plenty of food to share, they all began to relax and talk to each other, celebrating their good fortune. Honesty noticed the curious eyes of those around him, so she stood, pulling Pin to his feet and clearing her throat, drawing more interest their direction. "Good day. My name is Honesty Goodness, and I am the daughter of the wealthiest merchant under Skylands," she said enthusiastically. "This, my good fellows," she paused for effect with arms wide open, "is Pin, Lord Petal's latest invention." She grinned as if she was Lord Petal's invention herself. She turned towards Pin, her eyes sparkling with excitement. She now had an audience. Children left tables with food in hand to crowd around Honesty and her mechanical friend. They stood or sat in awe as Honesty described how she was knocked off her feet by Pin the mechanical boy. There wasn't a child in that great hall that hadn't heard of Lord Petal and his fantastic gadgets and incredible inventions. The children crowded closer to see Pin and his unusual mechanics, and many began to ask him questions about how he was made and what Lord Petal was like. Honesty kept answering on Pin's behalf, interrupting him more than once because Honesty was Pin's only friend. He smiled at her with gratitude, which only gave her more encouragement to continue interrupting him. The children asked to touch Lord Petal's top hat that sat on Pin's head, and before long it had made its way around the small crowd. They asked about his backpack and buttons. As Honesty didn't know the answers to these, she asked Pin. He didn't know, and told her so, which she then promptly expanded on, basically giving the same answer but in much more elaborate detail. Pin marveled at her ability to hold wide-eyed attention while talking about someone other than herself. As Honesty giggled and talked with those around him, Pin began to wonder, not for the first time in his short life, what it would be like to taste a mouthful of food. Pin looked over the almost empty platters and picked up a ripe red apple, the brightest object on the table, and turning it over in his hands, curious that something so delicate could bring so much sustenance to a human body. It was about that time he noticed Honesty had stopped talking, yawning her delicate mouth behind her gloved hand. She began talking more slowly about the supposed inner workings of Lord Petal's walking dog, another famous invention of his. She paused again to pass on another contagious yawn that many of the children were sharing. She looked at Pin and blinked back the overwhelming tiredness she had come under. She took the red apple from his hand and looked back at him, slumping down on her seat. "Oh, Pin, something's wrong. Something is dreadfully wrong. I think we've been drugged. The food." Honesty let the apple pass from her hand as she laid her head on her arms on the tabletop and fell asleep. Pin watched as many other children followed Honesty to their seats or the floor. One small child rested her head in Honesty's lap, while another slowly climbed onto the tabletop, falling asleep where he lay. Pin watched the red apple roll past sleeping children, coming to a messy stop under the foot of the butler. He grinned a toothless grin at Pin as the dock worker stepped up next to him, pointing at Pin what looked like an oversized elephant gun. Bang! Went the gun. "This is not good indeed," said Pin, as a new metal net flew at him, snagging him and tripping him as he tried to flee. He lay on the hall floor and the foot of the dining table, hearing the horrible men cackling with laughter at their good fortune. "Looks like we caught ourselves an automatonation in our nets today. The boss man'll be most pleased. Most pleased indeed." Pin did not like the sound of that at all. Chapter 7. Hanging in an oversized birdcage, one not unlike the delicate homes of the dangerous fair animals, Pin watched 6 blackened children shovel coal into the hungry mouth of an engine boiler. They were slaves, forced into manual labor in the bowels of the city. The room was stifling hot and terribly loud with the noise of machinery. Little feet scurried back and forth while little hands gripped coal-coated buckets and shovels. These wretched children shuffled to the coal chute, where a large pile of black rock towered above them. They dug their blunt shovels into the stack, dragged back a scoop of coal, then shuffled the 10 steps it took to get to the furnace mouth, where they would quickly deposit the coal into the boiler, trying not to get too close to the heat. Then they'd shuffle after the children before them, back to the coal stack for yet another shovelful of coal. It was sweaty, tiring work of a full-grown adult, yet there they were, 12 children, working 5-hour about shifts to keep the engine fires high. In the 5 days since Pin and the children were captured, Pin had been subject to questioning, hammering, and tickling sort of torture. When the evil butler and his guards finally gave up trying to reprogram the metal boy, they tried to shut him up in a cage, but Pin wouldn't move. Eventually, when they asked him nicely, and he complied, he was dragged to the engine room where Honesty and her crew were working, and hung up from a support beam in the roof. Watching the whole process take place below him, Pin had quickly calculated what Lord Pedo's engineering genius had missed. The room was too small to accommodate the number of full-size adults needed to keep the engines fully loaded with coal in order to keep the city afloat. So the horrible workers had replaced themselves with children to meet the engine stoking requirements. He watched Honesty wipe her gloved wrist across her sweaty face, smearing black across her bow. She looked for Pin in the cage at the back of the room, smiled weakly at his predicament, and kept marching towards the coal stack. He felt much concern for her, and although he didn't quite understand why this was happening, he knew somehow that it was very, very wrong. The whole situation was wrong. He watched another shift change, the tiny coalies coming and going. The boilers were loaded with coal. The engines kept running and Skylands kept flying. After many days of hanging around in his cage, he was interrupted out of his aloneness by a jolt to his foot and a tickling sensation running over his overhanging leg. He twisted around in his cage to find Spidey climbing through the gilded bars. He was indeed surprised to find this little critter so high above where he had just last left, and delighted he was. "Spidey, you loyal creature, how did you find me?" Spidey claimed onto Pin's extended hand and turned to show him the blinking light on his neck. "You were able to track me? Lord Pedo is a clever engineer indeed." He smiled at his friend in good fortune, then remembered the children. "We need to get out of here, Spidey. Do you know the way?" "Of course you do." Spidey nodded his head in confirmation. The little mechanical creature skittered from Pin's hand down his thigh to the bars of the cage. He extended a delicate claw and proceeded to saw through the metal with the edge of his jagged leg. A guard arrived, causing a pause in Spidey's rescue efforts. He hid under Pin's hands while the guard berated the children, harassing them with a club and very gruff words. Pin watched as Honesty hid younger, smaller children behind her skirts. She kept her eyes down, shovel in hand, and shooed the kids towards the coal stack. Passing Pin on the way past, he felt a burn in his chest, and a frown graced his face. He took a moment to decipher this new sensation in his being, and deduced that he was concerned for Honesty's well-being. She was his friend, and apart from Spidey and his Pepe, she was the only person who cared for him. He needed to escape and rescue the poor girl and take her home. When the guard left and Spidey removed the offending lock, Pin dropped it down in front of Honesty as she passed. She looked up at him with wide eyes, full of hope once again. She smiled and began to whisper to the young children around her, who then looked up at him, too. Hope spread like wildfire, each set of eyes saying what Pin couldn't say aloud. It was time to escape. Chapter 8. It took a while for Honesty and Pin to hatch a plan to free all of Sky City's child slaves. We are not the only boiler room slaves in the city, Pin. Honesty sat and watched the mechanical boy, shoveling with a tool in each hand, moving quickly across the boiler room. Scoop, trundle, tip, trundle, scoop, trundle, tip. His speed and strength matched the work of all 6 children on shift, and he was able to alleviate their burden while they slept on the floor next to Honesty. Yes, by my calculation, our boiler room alone would not be enough to keep the city in the sky. He paused and tilted his head in thought, when Spidey skittered right into his heel with a piece of coal on his back. Pin lifted his shoe to let the critter by. There will be another 2 such rooms underground, much the same as this. He resumed his work, careful of his spider friend. 2? Goodness me, that would mean another... She paused to calculate. 24. 24 children who could not possibly be caught up in this work. Yes, so if we're able to make our escape, we must also free the other boiler room coolies as well. Honesty sat back on her hands with an eyebrow raised high. Then she gave a rather unladylike groan and covered her face. There is no need for concern, Honesty. With Spidey's help, we will free everyone and send them straight home. Pin knew it was a simple plan, mostly involving Spidey picking every lock they came across, and the children finding their own way home once they reached the city streets above. To prove Honesty, Spidey's usefulness, they had him unlock the supply closet to give the younger children blankets to wear for warmth once they escaped. Pin and Spidey set out for reconnaissance. He came back hours later and indicated by tapping that there was 2 other engine rooms they needed to free children from. See, it is but a few doors between Spidey's tools and our freedom. He knows the way. We follow him, and, as my Peppy would say, superb as a sprocket. But what about the guards? A boy Honesty's age asked. Spidey tapped Pin's shoulder in a sort of Morse code, and Pin was able to translate. They come and go like clockwork. We won't be able to do it all. Free all 3 boiler rooms in one night. Yes, you are correct. The faces of the children surrounding the room fell. They didn't want to stay there any longer than they could help it. Not to worry, we will make it all work out fine. And he proceeded to draw a map of the city underground and their plan of escape. They revised the original plan to try and rescue all the children over 2 nights, freeing their engine room first, then the next one closest. Spidey would lead Pin to each room to set kids free by himself. No, that's a terrible idea, Pin. I won't allow it, demanded Honesty. Pin was perplexed at her sudden change in emotion, which for Honesty wasn't unusual, but he was still perplexed. Pin, I will not allow you to go to the next engine room all on your own. You must simply accept my help, or these poor children may not be set free. Please explain your concern, Honesty. I do not understand. For he truly didn't understand. I thought it was a good idea for me to go alone. I didn't want you or anyone else to get caught again, or worse, injured, while trying to escape. Honesty straightened her top hat, took Pin's hand, and looked into his eyes. Pin, you are the most amazing example of Lord Peto's ingenious engineering and gadgeteering that this world has ever seen. I cannot bear to think that something awful could happen to you while you were trying to get free from a place that I dragged you to. Pin, please do not go alone. Let me come with you. I can watch behind us while Spidey watches in front. I can help free the younger children and get them topside. Please let me help, she pleaded. Thank you, Honesty, for your friendship. I do not want you to get hurt. You have been through much more than your biological body can manage. He tapped his finger to his chin. But you have a point. He looked at her. I could use your help to keep an eye out, to help with the younger children. He nodded. All right, Honesty. I will use your help. But you follow me where I go and do what I do, understand? He asked her. She jumped up and down again, quietly squealing like her old self, a very dirty, sooty black version of her old self, but her old self all the same. Pin smiled in gratitude. Honesty smiled back. Pin, thank you. Together we can make this work. When should we do this? Honesty, how about tonight? He asked. It was decided. That night would be their night for escape and rescue. Chapter 14. It happened so quickly that even Pin's sensors found it difficult to comprehend what took place. 1 minute, Pin felt sensations that indicated he was free-falling, heading straight towards the sand beach below. The next minute, a click sounded, and he was soaring just above the surf, flying on his own pair of wings. He used his gyro who's-it-what's-it to guide himself above the waves, using changes in the air currents to lift him higher. Leaning right, he turned full circle, climbing higher into the sky. He looked at Spidey as the critter tapped his neck. Spidey tickled his ears, climbing up his head, and tapped on his goggles. Pulling the goggles over his eyes, Pin used their magnification to see in greater detail schools of fish surfing the waves and a flock of birds heading towards land. He could see for miles with them on. Spidey curled up in his shirt collar as they continued to climb higher on his wonderful wings. What a sight! Pin turned to look at his newfound wings. They weren't very big considering his weight, but they did the job perfectly. They had come out of his backpack, folded out when Spidey released them as they fell. The wings folded up perfectly to fit into the space in his backpack, but once extended, they measured twice his height across. He couldn't determine the type of material they were made of, but believed them to be made of some kind of lightweight titanium alloy. His appreciation of Lord Peto's genius grew to new heights. Pin leaned into his left shoulder, turning again. He found Lord Peto and Monstro lifting slowly above the village. The residents waved from their homes and fields. Many pointed at Pin flying around the massive balloon, cheering him on. Pin watched Lord Peto smile and wave to those below him. So he, too, smiled and waved, to whom he wasn't sure, but wave he did. Pin, how marvelous you found your wings! Pin watched as his Pepe leaned over the edge of the balloon's wicker basket to yell at him. "I must say they work perfectly. Come join me in Monstro, my giant of a hot air balloon." Pin circled, calculated his trajectory, and lined himself up to land just above the basket. He pulled his wings in at the last minute, using momentum to land him in the right place. He crash-landed upside down, his air and his hat covering his face, goggles and all. Lord Petal laughed so hard that he landed on his bottom next to Pin in the bottom of the basket. There they sat, laughing with each other, until Petto leaked tears. "Oh, Pinnachia, my boy, well done!" he exclaimed. "Now tell me, where has your grand adventure taken you? How did you manage?" Pin relayed to his Pepe the whole strange story, how he met Honesty, their trip to Skylands, the penny farthing ride, the children's buffet, and the trouble they both got into. He spoke of Spidey's rescue, their trip through the belly of the city, and the children they escaped with. At long last, as the sun began its downward climb, Pin spoke of trying to find Lord Petto in his home, and how he discovered he had wings strapped to his back. Lord Petto laughed again, clapping Pin on his shoulders. "I'm so glad you are safe, and I'm glad you made it back in time to see Monstro in all his glory." They both looked up at the inside of the giant black balloon and its methane-fueled engine. They slowly floated over the land, while it was Lord Petto's turn to explain what he had been up to, while Pin and Spidey were lost to him. "It was actually this giant project that kept me busy while you were on your grand adventures. You see, when you did not return from the market that day, I worried and fretted for days that something terrible must have happened to you. And, might I add, I had reason to worry. Something terrible did happen to you. I asked all over town for you until a sky dock worker said he saw you and a little lady take passage to Skylands. It's a long story, but I had vowed many years ago never to set foot in that city again. But I couldn't just leave you there, so I got out the plans for this contraption, and within days had it complete. I was just about to attempt a rescue of my own when you finally turned up. My boy, I'm very proud of you. Well done." He hadn't stopped smiling since Pin and Spidey returned. Chapter 15. They sat for a time in silence, until Lord Petto stood, adjusted their trajectory, set the burner going again, so he could lift to higher cross currents to take them back home again. They drifted higher, through the billowing cumulus clouds, to the currents that swept in the opposite direction. Once their village was in sight, Lord Petto asked Pin to climb up the side of the balloon, as the top vent needed adjusting. "I can't seem to get it open to let the hot air out. If we do not get this vent open, we might just keep flying to the moon." He chuckled. "Will you do it, my boy?" "I have guts, my lord," he replied, pulling his goggles on again. Lord Petto roared with laughter, causing Pin some confusion. He stepped up on the side of the basket and pulled himself up the guy ropes to Monstro's top vent. It took some careful effort to adjust the vent, as he didn't want to rip the material. He released it, and the hot air whistled through the opening, fogging up Pin's goggles. Then it all went wrong. They descended too fast, and the ground came rushing at them before Pin even made it back down to the basket. "Hold tight, my boy. It's going to be a bumpy landing," yelled Lord Petto. They held on as the beach rose up to meet them. The basket bumped twice before turning and spilling most of its contents, dropping Monstro's envelope into the sea. Lord Petto had managed to stay inside the basket, and hooted in pleasure once the balloon came to a stop. He clambered out, laughing at his misfortune, already calculating the needed design modifications. Villagers arrived from nearby to assist, helping Lord Petto gather up the now deflated balloon. "Pin, my boy, come and give your old man a hand with this," he called. But when he heard no response, he dropped the swamping material and scrambled around to find Pin's whereabouts. "Help me lift this. Help me with the basket," he demanded. A couple of strong men helped him lift it from the ground, only to find Pin, his incredible mechanical boy, underneath it. They all stopped what they were doing to watch Lord Petto gather Pin in his arms. He looked at the boy's silent face in sadness. Lifting his eyes to those nearest, he spoke. "My boy, he was so brave. He saved them all, you know," and sat for a moment before carrying Pin back to his castle on the bluff. It took him many days to repair Pin's damage. Honesty came with coach in tow and introduced themselves to the engineering genius. Lord Pin took them under his wings as mentor and guide, and instructed them at every chance, giving Honesty and Coach a fast-track education in higher engineering mechanics. They began to see just how important Pin was to this gentleman, and it became their priority each day to apprentice under him in order to bring Pin back to life. And try they did. After the 12th time rebooting his systems to no avail, they sat back and wondered where they had gone wrong. Lord Petto scratched his face in frustration and picked up a cold cup of tea. Honesty removed grease-covered gloves and huffed hair out of her face. Coach crossed and uncrossed his arms, only to cross them again. Never ones to give up, they all started talking at once. "We might need to take the... Why don't we try the... about removing the..." They erupted in laughter. The stress of the operation broken in an instant. They moved over to Pin's plans to discuss their next move, leaving Pin lying on the bench table. Then a curious thing happened. Spidey crawled up his arm and into his shirt. He found a series of cogs and wires in Pin's chest and set off an electrical charge by touching his little head to the heart of Pin's mechanics. He climbed out again and tapped at Pin's collar. Pin blinked a few times as his visual sensors came into focus. He smiled at Spidey and sat up on the table, while the other three were hovering over blueprints and designs. They didn't notice Pin had joined them, watching over their shoulder. They continued to discuss Pin on ways to set things right again. Is it worth removing his core and replacing that? Was it damaged somehow in the crash? Asked Honesty. She looked to Petto for answers. "I've already thought about this, but we risk losing who Pin is if we tamper with this," the engineer replied. "What about his fuel cells? Could they be replaced?" asked Coach. "Replaced them twice already. It doesn't seem to make any difference," he replied. "What about an electrical charge to his core matrix? Give it a boost?" asked Pin with a grin. Honesty squealed in delight, jumped into his arms, laughing as she hugged him tight. Coach and Petto each slapped his back, glad to have him back. "It's good to have you back, my son," Lord Petto declared. "Thank you. It's good to be back, Pepe." Pin smiled in gratitude. And, well, that was that. It hadn't taken long for the story of the Lazarus children to hit the newsstands groundside, with a fantastical story of a mechanical superboy and his insect saving the day. Nor had it taken long for the child slave trafficking ring to be discovered when Skyland started falling slowly out of the sky. It became imperative for authorities to find out who was supposed to be working the engine boiler rooms and was neglecting their duty. The news articles went on to say that the city management had quickly hired a group of 7 dwarves at an incredible pay rate. Nothing was mentioned of the gang who had stolen the children in the first place, but Pin did find a rather peculiar story about how circus animals were found eating a butler and a dock worker. Pin smiled and closed the newspaper, ready for his next grand adventure. The end. So quoth this raven.